All right, good morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to MEI's Defense Leadership Series, which is in its seventh episode today. I can't believe we've done six already. Our guest is retired Rear Admiral Joseph Sarkis from the Lebanese Armed Forces, who is joining us from Beirut today live. My name is Bilal Saab. I'm the founder and director of the Defense and Security Program at MEI, where I'm also a senior fellow. The Defense Leadership Series has now become a core component of this program, and I'm very proud of it. Given the content it's releasing and the caliber of guests it has had the pleasure of hosting. We were especially fortunate, I should say, to have CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie inaugurate the series on June 10th of this year. Admiral Sarkis is our first guest from the region, though not for lack of trying to bring on other military and defense officials from the Arab world. I should say that topics related to national security and military affairs are quite sensitive in that part of the world, and few officials are willing to speak, especially if they are still serving. But hey, we'll keep trying and we'll keep pushing. That remains my promise, which I've been trying to honor for almost a decade, which tells you that I'm not doing a good job. Let me say a couple of words about Admiral Sarkis, who's a good friend of mine, and then we'll get right into it because we have a ton to cover. Joseph is now a non-resident scholar with MEI's Defense and Security Program. He retired from the Lebanese Armed Forces, I'm going to call them the LAF for the remainder of this conversation, after a career of 37 years, during which he held a variety of command and staff positions, including most recently Deputy Chief of Staff for Planning from August 2017 to December of 2019. And in this latest role, Joseph was responsible for strategic planning to include capability development of human, material, financial resources, and of course, operational issues to cover, of course, in his space, maritime security, border protection, land and sea also, developing and establishing concepts, doctrine, metrics to measure the LAF's effectiveness. He led the strategic dialogue also, importantly, between the LAF and UNIFIL, which is the UN force in Lebanon, for the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701. And before overseeing strategic planning, Joseph was the naval assistant to the LAF Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations from June of 2012 to July of 2017, and he did command LAF naval operations from August 2004 to June 2012. He did a lot during that period, including countering smuggling attempts and facilitating emergency relief assistance, search and rescue, and recovery at sea, in addition, of course, to the delimitation of Lebanon's maritime boundaries and drafting national laws related to the sovereign maritime rights of the country. There is a lot more that Joseph has done throughout his military career, for which he has received many honors and awards, but I'll leave it up to you to please check out his bio on the MEI website, that he's a member of the family. And I will say that Joseph graduated from the French Naval Academy. He completed his professional military education in the United States as a distinguished graduate in military strategy from the Naval War College. He does hold 2 master's degrees, one in international relations from Auburn University of Montgomery. Just don't tell my wife, she's a huge Alabama fan. And the second in military operational art and science from Air University, Air Command and Staff College in Maxwell Air Force Base. Joseph, first of all, welcome to the MEI family. It's an honor to have you on the team. Congratulations on your well-deserved retirement, and thank you for doing this with us. Over to you.
Well, Bilal, thank you for the introduction. The honor is mine, and thank you for having me today. It's my pleasure to be with you. Hopefully today I can add my modest contribution for a better understanding about LAF. Thank you.
You got it. Before we start this conversation, let me emphasize this because I think it's important. Admiral Sarkis does not speak for the Lebanese Armed Forces. As I mentioned, he is happily a retired civilian in his beautiful home now in Beirut. So all the views he will share with us this morning are his and his only. They do not reflect those of his previous colleagues in the Lebanese army. But it was important for me to say that one more time. Okay, we have a lot to cover, Joseph, and we'll try to do this as usual within the next hour. But I want to start with current items because those are issues that are on the mind of a lot of people. There's quite a bit of interest in those issues. Since the explosion in the port of Beirut, tell us, what role has the LAF played on the ground? Has it been coordinating with international organizations and maybe even governments regarding the distribution of goods and humanitarian relief? So what role has the LAF played on the ground since the explosion?
Well, Bilal, let me start by saying that what happened is outrageous. It's a massive blast, immense suffering. But now I think on the way to recover, thanks to the international humanitarian assistance, the US, part of it, always there. Not to forget, the Young Lebanese Initiative, local associations, and for having LAF at the center of the recovery effort, in fact. So let me start by saying that assistance and disaster relief is one of the core missions of LAF. So to that end, LAF established what we call today is the Beirut Forward Emergency Room. It's intended to orchestrate disaster relief efforts working on two fronts, actually. So you have on one front, you have Beirut Port and the surrounding inhabited areas now damaged, unfortunately. So the objective is obviously to maximize impact, efficiency, and transparency. So currently you have LAF assisting in removing the rubble, I think conducting also damage surveys and planning for the subsequent actions to be taken. And LAF is coordinating the whole effort of distribution, actually, and this is where it's the most important role, to cover supplies like health, shelter, emergency food, and construction material. And according, I think, to the last official statement of LAF on August 29, 50% of the whole received humanitarian assistance were distributed by LAF to families in the damaged areas. In addition, I think LAF is leading also on the damage survey with 250 dedicated military and civilian engineering teams. And the objective here is to try to rehabilitate most of the damaged houses before November 15, wintertime. So to finish answering your question, I think it's worth mentioning, though, that international parties have entrusted LAF to make sure that their assistance goes directly to the people in greatest need of support and not to fall in the wrong hands. And my understanding is, on that line, that LAF is, in its current and significant role, is receiving and is staging and is coordinating the whole effort of distribution. And I trust it is in full coordination with international partners, the civic society representatives, and the active registered NGOs.
Okay. There's always a risk of overstretch with the Army, given the portfolio that it has, and especially recently with the obscure clashes in multiple areas in the country, and now it has to take a leading role in coordinating with those international organizations and international governments. Let me take you a step back before that, because obviously there's a huge political crisis in the country, and there's been a good number of demonstrations in the streets, even before the blast, and most likely will continue, given the miserable state of affairs of governance by the politicians. During those demonstrations, Joseph, there were concerns that elements of the LAF were seen beating up protesters, and there was just, I guess, videos of showing that. Can you just, given what you know, obviously, can you just help us clarify what happened, and have those concerns been addressed? And then add to that, what role should the Army play to reduce tensions moving forward, since, as I mentioned, the protesters most likely will return to the streets and air their concerns and grievances, which is absolutely the right.
Well, Bilal, thank you for bringing this up. I know there is a lot of expectations regarding LAF's role. So if you ask me where LAF stands today, well, what is obvious to me these days is where the others stand from LAF, actually. LAF, on one side, is suspected by some Lebanese politicians for not responding appropriately to popular protests.
Uh-huh.
And at the same time, it is accused by the demonstrators themselves, actually, for using excessive violence. And LAF has been in this extremely delicate position for the last 10 months.
Yeah.
And everyone knows, I mean, and you know that the media is not helping and LAF is not voicing.
Right.
The media is showing these violent clashes, and most of the time it is refraining to show how the agitators amongst the peaceful demonstrators are using violence and provoking LAF soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
I see on daily basis, like most of the Lebanese, how LAF soldiers continue to show courageous restraint despite the violence against them. Although I completely approve the people's expectations, I mean, to have LAF protecting their right to peacefully demonstrate, and I respect, I mean, and also the respect of the demonstrators' freedom of expression. So this is all, I mean, it's given. But I don't believe, I mean, LAF can protect the agitators' freedom of destruction. So with that in mind, I believe LAF troops are operating along those considerations, right? With clear, and to my knowledge, I mean, with clear and strict orders not to use live ammunitions. However, I recognize there has been cases where those orders were violated. I mean, no one is hiding that. And for that specific case, I understood also that LAF is investigating the circumstances, and my expectations are that it will sanction the indicted simply because I am confident that LAF is fully aware of the importance of not losing the Lebanese people's trust. However, one must admit that LAF cannot side with the protesters or with those who are against them. But I do admit that LAF may have a dialogue with each one of them. To finish, in my humble opinion, I mean, what LAF can do, and I speak for myself, I mean, as you said, it is to consolidate the Lebanese people's trust by remaining as their best hope for ensuring a safe landing for the country in these very difficult and critical times until a new capable and reformist government is formed. I truly believe and personally believe that this is LAF's bet for the Lebanese people.
Okay. A lot to unpack as far as the history of the institution, and we're going to try to do this briefly, Joseph, but we'll take you back in history and tell you obviously that no army functions in a political and social vacuum. The story of the LAF, I think, will very much help us understand its past and present struggles, and maybe also identify opportunities that may lie ahead for the institution. I'd like to believe, just based on my own reading of the history of the organization, that the LAF has not been given a fair start. Tell us why, from the days of independence from French rule, 1943, to more recent years, there wasn't much of an appetite among Lebanese for a strong national army, not even just among Lebanese, but also its own neighbors, right? And how has this history affected the evolution of the LAF?
A great question, Bilal. I mean, most probably, though, it requires a lengthy answer.
Well, absolutely. I'm being very unfair,
I'm not sure,
but
I'm not sure we have time for that.
No, but I think it's important for the audience to understand that, you know, this organization has had to deal with a lot, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that really nobody until very recently has wanted this organization to prosper and to function as an actual military, right?
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, good thing it changed recently, but you have to go through that history a little bit.
I'm going to try to answer this question in a concise and reasonable manner, and we'll try to highlight the most relevant details though. So the story of LAF, is one of those stories with significant ups and downs in a highly volatile Middle East region. But long story short, it is the story of I would call it, of a non-immune Lebanon with weakened security and military organizations. And I believe the government of Lebanon after the independence in 1943 intentionally kept its armed forces small and weak due to internal conflict, probably due to internal conflicting sectarian politics.
Right.
But since the 50s, the Lebanese politicians, my understanding also is they were unwilling to incur the cost of maintaining a large army. Mm-hmm. Most probably, they feared that it would certainly embroil Lebanon in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And later, we jump now to the civil war in 1975. Right. Those same prominent politicians of all religious groups expressed a sense of insecurity towards each other. Yep. And with time, they managed to establish and command their own private militias, leading actually to the division of Lebanon in multiple sectarian geographic areas. Mm-hmm. And with that, you had a militia security system that was established. It weakened LAF and it led to its disintegration. Now, to end the civil war, just in a quick summary, a peace agreement, the Taif Accord, came into play in 1990. It was implemented under Syrian control, and giving that accord, LAF was restructured according to its current organization, but not strengthened. So I'm not going to go endlessly here. I will finish and say that LAF evolution really was conditioned primarily by two factors. So one is, I would say, the fear that a strong army would erode the personal power of prominent politicians. Right. And secondly, let me say that the need for security and stability was really a driving factor when sectarian militias failed to provide safety and security for their own constituencies.
Right. Can I add something to it? And I think it's sort of related, which has been the very nature of Lebanese society, which obviously has liberal impulses. And so they've always wanted to evade the authoritarian course of their neighbors, which has taken on a military-dominated regime, right? And so they went completely the opposite way when the pendulum swung too far on the side of freedom, right, to the point of anarchy. And I guess you could add that as another factor of keeping the army as weak as possible.
Well, could be. That's the Lebanese
Is that
people
too generous
always,
of an interpretation?
I'm not sure, but I think the Lebanese people, has always been for democracy in their aspirations and their freedom of expression and the media. This is how they live. Freedom is part of their daily life. But you need a security institution to protect that freedom and those democratic ideals, if I may say. Right. So I'm not sure. It's really a tricky line to walk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, you mentioned the Civil War, Joseph. So I'd be remiss not to mention 1976, right, when the army disintegrated along sectarian lines. Just tell us about that episode. is that still fresh in the minds of current serving commanders? Or is that just too, it's a long time ago, and it really doesn't affect how the army operates today, how it thinks, and doesn't really fear that this might return?
Well, yes. I think a practical way to answer this important question is to expand actually on the first one.
Yep.
1 year after the beginning of the Civil War, the army disintegrated, as you said, and during those difficult times, I think LAF soldiers, like most of the Lebanese people, could not move freely inside Lebanon from one region to another.
Right. So
you had LAF soldiers deserted, and they joined the militias of their respective religious communities. And so you had, as I said, this militia security system, and we had also the Syrian troops present in Lebanon since 1976, and the Israeli army occupying South Lebanon in 1982. So as a result, we end up with few soldiers left under LAF's control. And LAF then was one of the many security actors rather than the sole or dominant one. And later, with the end of the Civil War, those same politicians again reached the conclusion that only a national army could reunite the country and replace their various militia. And indeed, LAF as one national army reunited the country and adopted a new approach by including conscription. And it was a good step, actually, to blend the new generations of young Lebanese in one cohesive social fabric away from sectarianism. But to finish my answer, I think LAF's disintegration is a very important lesson learned for the consecutive LAF commanders. And I trust they will do what it takes to mitigate LAF's disintegration. One, by keeping the country united, but most importantly, I think by shaping LAF as an institution, and I will say also by gaining the Lebanese people's trust, by definitely strengthening LAF's foundational principle of neutrality. I think those are two important components to keep a one cohesive national armed force that is at the same distance of all the Lebanese political parties and confession, that is able to be trustful and to appeal to whenever this country is going through security difficulties.
Yeah. Joseph, I'm of the view that probably nothing has hurt the growth of the Lebanese army more than the era stretching from 1990, which is when the Civil War ended with the signing of the Taif Accord, to 2005, when the last Syrian soldier exited the country as a result of course, demonstrations in the streets, more than 1 million people after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, the former prime minister, and of course, international, primarily US pressure. That was an era that was called Pax Syriana, which was essentially dominated by the Syrian intelligence in the country and also the Syrian army. What can you share with an American audience of how destructive that period was, not just for the country, but more specifically for the army, in terms of its growth, in terms of its evolution?
Bilal, your question is highlighting actually a critical period in LAF's evolution after the 1990 Taif Accord.
A long period, yeah.
Yeah. Given that accord and being under Syrian control, LAF was restructured in its current form. It was partially rearmed and professionalized, right, with a desire to reach confessional balance and to integrate, let me say, around 6,000 former militiamen from different political orientations in exchange to dismantle their existing militias, but except for Hezbollah, of course. And then based on these considerations, LAF Command intentionally blended the troops coming from the different parts of Lebanon to shape LAF and attempt, to shape LAF into one national social institutions. Nevertheless, I think between 1990 and 2005, being under what I call the pervasive Syrian influence and the lack of monopoly of the legitimate use of force, LAF was unable to establish an independent defensive strategy. And so as a result, you had Lebanon relying on Syrian troops to enforce effective control over the entire territory, to the extent to have the Syrian and Hezbollah ensuring Lebanon's defense. So to finish here, I think the result was that LAF adopted an ad hoc modus operandi, working on reunification and restructuring, but not on LAF strengthening.
Yeah. Well, it certainly didn't help that some of the commanders who presided over that period were obviously under the influence of Damascus, and so therefore they had to be quite sensitive to the wishes of Damascus, and that certainly played a big role. All right, let me take you to some operational issues, because I think there will be a lot of interest to some former CENTCOM colleagues of mine and folks who have a lot of interest in military issues. So let me take you to December 31st, 1999. Country in the whole world was obviously getting ready for millennium celebrations. maybe already celebrating, depending on where you were. And a relatively small and obscure band of Sunni fanatics called the Takfir and Hijra launched an attack on the Lebanese military in the town of Daniya, which is in the northern part of the country near Tripoli, which is Lebanon's second largest city, what we also call the capital of the north, right? That episode shocked the Lebanese and brought back, fears of widespread violence. Tell us what happened then. How did the army deal with that mini insurrection, which obviously I should say that it was ultimately defeated by the Lebanese army? I guess that would be the first episode of a violent confrontation, and the first test, I guess, after the end of the civil war between the army and a local opponent or a local enemy.
Absolutely, not sure about the local thing though. But let me tell you one thing. Well, shocked, I mean, the word you use is a very good description to what was felt during that time. Because, I mean, after almost 9 years of stability under Syrian control, the terrorist group Al-Takfir wal-Hijra succeeded in launching an attempt to create an Islamist mini-state in northern Lebanon. I mean, those terrorists from different nationalities infiltrated, as you said, the mountainous area in the Daniya district in northern Lebanon. And after an intense combat that lasted 8 days, actually, they were swiftly defeated by a force of 13,000 Lebanese soldiers backed by tanks and artillery. And for that combat, LAF reported, if I recall the numbers right, I think I have a total of 12 soldiers killed in action, while on the insurgent side, they were like 55 captured. So when interrogated, the captured terrorist admitted receiving financial support from associates of bin Laden, Osama bin Laden. And this is why I told you, I mean, I don't believe it was pretty local. I mean, we are talking here January 2000. And this same interrogation led to the identification of a transnational terrorist network linked to the Daniya group. And that same network was indicted for involvement in the Millennium bombing plots in Jordan, Los Angeles, and India. To finish, I think the importance of this battle was first in its contribution to dismantle, if I may say, transnational terrorist networks, right? And secondly, and you name it, I mean, in your question, and I agree, I mean, it was for me a building block for the forthcoming LAF's journey in the war against terrorism.
Right, and that's the reason why I mention it, Joseph, because as comprehensive as the operation was against ISIS just in recent years, in 2017, and also the North, I just wanted to highlight this was not the first time that the LAF actually had engaged such an enemy. It did way back in 2000 or 1999, I should say. And then, of course, in 2007 in the Al-Badid, which we will talk about in a minute. So it's been quite an experience of confrontation with this kind of enemy. But before we get to Nahl Badid, obviously 2005, as we just agreed, you and I, was a turning point in not only in the history of the country, but also in the history of the institution, because this is when the Syrians were forced to withdraw. Just bring me back to what perceptions existed then, or what feelings were shared by the Lebanese army leadership at the time when the Syrians left. Was there jubilation? Was there a worry that now that they have to take over, security of the country on their own, or is it a mix of both? How was the feeling at the time when the Syrians withdrew from the country?
Indeed. I mean, I agree. 2005 was definitely a turning point in Lebanon's history, and LAF is no exception. To start answering the question, I think it's important to remember that 2005 started with a terrible event, the assassination of Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri.
Right.
And as a result, you had those huge demonstrations that reached up to 1 million people. You had on one side demonstrations calling for a swift withdrawal of the Syrian troops out of Lebanon, while on the other side you had demonstrations led by Hezbollah against the withdrawal of Syria. Additionally, and I would say fortunately, you had US President George Bush spearheading the international community's calls in support of the Lebanese people's demand for Syria to withdraw from Lebanon. And as a result, you had the Syrian withdrew in 2005, knowing that the Israeli previously withdrew from southern Lebanon in 2000. So now you have this whole situation, as you can imagine. It created at the same time a huge security vacuum on one hand, and on the other hand, I think it's created a momentum for LAF to gain. And LAF did seize that opportunity. And in fact, it extended its influence on the southern part of the country. And at the same time, it adopted, if I may call it as such, an offensive posture towards internal destabilizing forces. It is worth mentioning, though, that during that time, LAF renewed its commitment to its foundational principle of neutrality on both the sectarian and the political levels. It was actually clearly demonstrated in LAF's refusal to oppress the collective civil demonstrations. I will end up here by saying that LAF's refusal, I think this is important, was an important step in the attempt to overcome political interferences. And I mean by that, a refusal when orders from the government clash with LAF's foundational principle of neutrality.
Let me take you to 2003, 2004, immediately after the US invasion of Iraq and occupation afterwards. And once that country descended into chaos, I think it was only a matter of time before violent extremism spread across the region and once again reared its ugly head in Lebanon. And that happened a couple of years later, as you very well know, on May 20th, 2007, which was exactly, ironically, 2 years after the Syrians had left the country. You wonder about the coincidence. And a group called Fatah al-Islam, maybe not as obscure as Takfir al-Hijra, because we had known that they had been operating in the north for some time, quite a proficient mobilization campaign, a good bit of training in the north, and of course, expansion of their presence and influence from one refugee camp to another, and actually expelling rival Palestinian groups to settle and set up shop ultimately in Nahr al-Barid. If the Dani confrontation was challenging, was bloody, this was a completely different kettle of fish. This made Dani look like a walk in the park. Obviously, the casualties were much more severe for the army. It was far more challenging. The terrain was obviously very different. This was an urban environment in which the LAF had very little experience. The intelligence was poor. Certainly, it lasted much longer, 3 months, and it ultimately required the complete destruction of the camp, essentially, in order to achieve military victory. And I should say that 174 service members of the LAF died as a result. Tell us about those very tense moments, 3 months, essentially, and how did you ultimately achieve victory?
No doubt. Bilal, no doubt, a very heavy loss for the LAF. The finest of its men. It was the most severe internal fighting since Lebanon's civil war, as you said, with an ill-equipped and underfunded LAF.
Right.
Just imagine the situation. Nevertheless, LAF in this battle proved to be, to a certain degree, proved its professional cohesion, its professionalism and cohesion, in purging, on a large scale, around 400 terrorists hidden in the Palestinian refugee camp of Nahr al-Barid. It is one of the densest populated areas, by the way, in northern Lebanon.
Right.
So after enforcing a sea and land blockade around the camp, LAF succeeded in securing a safe passage for exiting women, children, and the elderly held inside the camp. Right after, LAF used heavy artillery fires to eliminate snipers posted around the camp. And those same snipers, by the way, were behind the heavy human loss on the left side. Finally, LAF succeeded in securing avenues of approach for attacking the terrorists. And the conflict finally ended after 3 months of intense combat, with having LAF taking control of the camp at a very heavy cost, as you name it. I mean, 174 soldiers killed and more than 500 wounded.
Right.
I mean, while on the insurgent side, you had, like, I recall 2-to-1, I think was the ratio. Yep. 350 were killed and 19 captured.
Yeah.
So really, here I would like to stress, I mean, on a LAF accomplishment in this whole combat.
Yeah.
During that combat, I mean, LAF was lacking air support, and you had a LAF engineering regiment jointly with the Lebanese Air Force achieved what I would like to call a feat of ingenuity, if I may call it as such. And together, they changed the dynamic of the battle.
Right.
By converting, believe it or not, I mean, UH-1 helicopters into bombers, arming them with 880 pounds conventional bombs from the old grounded Hawker Hunter and Mirage 3 fighter jets.
That's right.
It was actually a decisive step that considerably shortened the conflict.
Yep.
And LAF walked out of this battle victorious and strengthened by an overwhelming popular support. Not only that, it was also praised by the international partners to be a professional, strong, and a cohesive force acting in conformity with international standards. And I mean by that the Geneva Conventions and the law of land warfare.
Let's stay with that about it for a bit, because once again, this is one of the most consequential battles until, of course, 2017 in the history of the LAF. You had a camp here that was obviously protected by a ton of buildings, right? And also underground bunkers that were used by the Palestinians in previous years to escape Israeli raids, right? So that made it even more complicated for this makeshift bomber, as you just described, basically, to hit its targets. My understanding is that perhaps less than a week after the start of the campaign, the LAF was essentially running out of weapons. And it became very clear that sustaining the fight was going to be the biggest challenge. And this is when the international community intervened, whether it's the Arab partners of the LAF and, of course, the United States. Tell us how critical, basically, was that assistance at the time in order to achieve success?
I think when I started my answer, I said, I mean, LAF was engaged in that fight with an ill-equipped and underfunded LAF. So really, it wasn't in the best conditions to be able to sustain itself during that fight. And I think this is where it was instrumental. I mean, the air bridge that the US has activated in order to supply LAF with enough ammunitions and weaponry. I mean, enough to ensure that LAF will be able to sustain itself during that combat. And I think this was tremendously important. And the US continues to stay next to the LAF. I mean, whenever it is engaged in combat against terrorism, and LAF at the same time, I think it's proving that it is a trustworthy partner in the fight against terrorism.
One final question about it, then. Sorry to dwell too much on that battle, since it's one of the things that I study as far as the military operations of the LAF. Your role at the time was quite critical, because it was a part of the strategy of basically encircling the camp and also making sure that the fighters would not escape from the sea, right? Because obviously the camp was bordering the Mediterranean Sea, so they could have smuggled, boats and whether it flew to Cyprus or Syria or what have you. Tell us more about the role of, as modest as the capabilities were, obviously, of the Navy, and they still are, unfortunately. Tell us, what role did you play at the time? What role did the Navy play? Which, let's be very frank, it was more of a Coast Guard force more than anything else.
It is, absolutely, it is. I mean, with modest capabilities that the Navy had during that time, and still, I think. But it's the thing is,
was there fire support from sea? Sorry.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what I'm gonna end up with. Is it was most importantly a blockade. I mean, encircling from the sea to hamper, if you want, or to deny any supplies coming from the sea to the Nahr Bad, or the escape of any terrorist from there. And the second one is to support the land forces by fire support from the sea, according to the modest gunnery that it would be, that is what existed. I mean, that existed on board the LAF ships. But definitely, I mean, it put LAF Navy in a good position, because on the other side of the aisle, I mean, you didn't have naval capabilities that would compete with the Navy modest capabilities.
Right. Okay. A decade later.
Yeah.
We're going to take you now to Dawn of the Outskirts campaign, once again in the northern part of the country, northeastern frontier, along the borders with Syria, but also inside Lebanese territory, in Arsal and other places. So it took a decade basically for the LAF to learn some lessons from Nahr Bared, to develop its capabilities, obviously in close partnership with the United States, learn some new tricks, do some proper planning. Tell me about that battle. Obviously, it did not last 3 months this time around. The casualties were minimal. And this was a campaign that was praised by top CENTCOM leadership and also U.S. defense officials. So tell me, why was it very different in 2017? Obviously, it's hard to compare apple to apple. This was a very different terrain. This was up in the mountains, rugged terrain, open field. The intel was so much better, and partly as a result of better planning, obviously, and of course the capabilities, Scan Eagle equipment, and all that sort of stuff. But just in terms of performance, in terms of how the LAF conducted its operations, why was it so much better? Why was it such an incredibly different result? And of course, we're talking about the campaign against ISIS, obviously, also a different kettle of fish, far better armed, 600 of them operating, having launched already multiple operations against the army, and also kidnapped a few, as I'm sure you'll mention. One of the aims of the operation of Dawn of the Outskirts was to at least learn of the fate of the 10 kidnapped Lebanese soldiers by ISIS. But I'll stop here. Tell me more about that absolutely monumental campaign that has, I would say, perhaps unfairly, dramatically changed the image of the LAF as a far more competent military in the Arab world, and probably one of the best.
Well, I think Uncle Sam might have something to do with it.
Okay. What did they do?
But to answer your question, I think it is critical to recall the context that preceded the eviction of ISIS militants in 2017. I mean, if you recall, I mean, after the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, Middle East region, I mean, ISIS was gaining ground in Iraq and Syria, right, taking advantage of open borders and the Syrian civil war. So in 2014, ISIS progression reached a barren, mountainous